and Peter has finally been able to say and confess that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And Jesus responds like a proud parent. Yes, finally, you got it. Right? Finally, you have figured it out. And then he says, and we're confused by this, and so is Peter. Then Jesus says to him, now don't tell anybody that. Don't tell anybody that I'm the Messiah. And we're all going, why? He's so proud. Why can't we tell it? Why can't we be celebrating this, right? Why can't we be out there just yes, right? And we kind of say, what? Why shouldn't this good news be spread? Why should it be kept quiet? And then I get thinking about it, right? And I ask you to think about it, right? Because is Jesus the perfect, is Jesus doing exactly what everybody thinks he's going to do? No. Exactly, right? Everybody's been raised up on these images of what a Messiah is, this triumphant, militaristic perhaps, in taking over and changing of what's happening. And that's not what is going to happen. And so can you imagine, right, that there's not going to be this Messiah with an army or a rebellion. There's just going to be a cross. I can understand why Jesus is like, hold on, know that I am the Messiah, and see what happens, right? Now, how many of us are really good at that? I think the disciples probably were still struggling with this, right? This notion that they were going to have to hold on to this tension about who Jesus was and what was happening. So we join our story where it basically says from that time on, Jesus is helping his disciples, and to use a modern word, deconstruct their messianic expectations. By that I mean he's helping them reevaluate what they've always thought was going to happen. Helping them understand that maybe their view is not God's view, right? Or maybe that they have absorbed some stuff that isn't quite supported in the text, maybe, right? So here they are in that moment of deconstruction, right? They're moving forward, they're moving forward towards Jerusalem in the shadow of death rather than the glory, I think, that maybe they had begun to anticipate, right? And Jesus reminds them again, has to remind them again. I mean, that's what he does all the time, right? He's just reminding the disciples about what he said before, right? But he said, reminding them again and again as they journey, that they're not headed for a throne in Jerusalem or anywhere else. They are headed towards a cross. There isn't going to be this army of zealots that appears out of nowhere. There's to make Jesus king, and instead they're going to be experiencing a mob and mocking and calling for Jesus' death. Right? And I think we can put ourselves in Peter's place, right? This is just too much. Right? You have said too much. You have pushed the envelope too far, Jesus, right? And his immediate response to Jesus is, no. Let's not do this. God forbid that this would happen, right? I mean, we get that, right? We get that, right? And no, so he says no to Jesus and no to the story he's hearing and no to the pain that is inevitably ahead, right? But Peter's response is not unexpected. He was raised on those stories of the coming of the Messiah being a political and social upheaval that changes everything immediately. And he's been living in hopes of a radical change in leadership. And he's been living in hope of the return of some golden age. And Peter responds out of his gut, a desire for transformation on the world's transformation in the world's terms rather than God's terms. Peter says no to Jesus. Just as others, I'll even say this radical statement, even ourselves will say no to Jesus down through the ages. In fact, looking at history, saying no to the way of Jesus becomes a habit, sometimes even for the church, right? Too often when Jesus says, okay, let's go, we're going towards the cross, the church votes crown or self. Or isn't there an easier way? Isn't there a less controversial way? Right? Remember when Jesus spent time in the wilderness following his baptism? Remember that time? Where Jesus, we call it the temptation of Jesus, right? Where one of the temptations is to gain power, authority and the ability to do crazy things and to have the kingdoms of the world and all their splendor for his taking. If he would just bow down, right? And Jesus knows the kind of temptation that Peter is dealing with, right? And that we deal with, right? How are we going to have enough power to affect change? How are we going to gain the ability to just wave our hand and have it all be all right? When Peter pulls Jesus aside, Jesus knows what's coming. He's been through this before. And Jesus responds with the force of frustration, like, why can't you get this? And he calls Peter Satan, not because he thinks Peter's a bad guy, but because he feels that force, that increeping way of choosing something different. Peter is forced to step back. Now, if Jesus is serious about what he's saying, what does this mean for Peter? What does it mean for us? What the heck is self-denial? In a culture of self-care, what does it mean to choose self-denial? Now, what does it mean to take up the cross? What does it mean to follow Jesus? Now, Matthew is really vague here. There aren't a lot of examples about what he means. I mean, I suppose he felt like maybe everybody should understand it if he gave a name to it and they would go, oh yeah, it's that thing, right? So in Matthew's vagueness, I feel like sometimes it's easier to say what it's not, right? Do you have that problem, right? Like, well, I know self-denial is not, right? So we'll start there. So self-denial is not staying in an abusive situation and valorizing it as one's cross to bear, right? That's not what we're talking about. Okay? We are not talking about hiding out from life, from the blessings and the joys and the responsibilities, and self-righteously calling attention to yourself, saying, I'm just so holy and perfect that I'm set apart and aside. It's not that either. And it isn't becoming a doormat and playing the victim. Right? I've done so much for you, right? So what is it? Self-denial and cross-bearing. What is that? Oh, and I want to make a point here that the text says the cross-bearing is you're going to pick up, it uses the word pick up their cross. So first of all, we are not expected to pick up Jesus' cross. Okay? Ooh. Does that feel a little lighter? Yeah, feels a little lighter, right? We're asked to pick up our cross. And it's not those things that I mentioned, right? Obviously, we started there, right? And self-denial and cross-bearing, I'm going to kind of use them interchangeably in the next little while because I think they're interconnected and they're metaphors. So there we go, right? But I think it's best explained, self-denial and cross-bearing, by looking at Paul's letter to the Romans in chapter 12, where there's a long list of virtues describing this cross-bearing self-denial we're talking about. So it says things like, let love be genuine, hate what is evil, hold fast to what is good. And things like love one another and rejoice in hope and persevere in prayer and pursue hospitality to strangers. Ooh. And bless those who persecute you and rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. I like this one. Do not be arrogant. Flat out says it, right? And that's just a few of them. I could read all of them, but you get the sense, right? You get the sense right. For us, cross-bearing and self-denial is service to one another with compassion as God's allies, setting aside our own agendas in favor of meeting human need. Now, I was trying to think of an example for this, right? And what came to mind this morning was my grandma Ruth. So Ruth was my father's second stepmother, my grandfather's third wife. He lost both of his earlier wives to death, and he married Ruth fairly quickly after the death of my grandma Laura, who had been his wife for 25 years. And because he'd grieved while she was dying, she had a painful battle with cancer, he was readied for companionship and connection far earlier than his daughter and daughter-in-law was. So when Grandma Ruth joined the family in the spring of 1973, my aunts were not pleased. They were not yet ready for the expansion of this family. Well, they were not the nicest to her. They were standoffish and aloof. But my grandma Ruth must have read Romans 12, because her response to these human people was to love them. To love them for years. For years. Beyond the death of my grandfather, who died just a few years later. Into my adulthood. I wasn't even born yet when she married into the family. My grandmother didn't die. Grandma Ruth died when I was 39. Anyway, so she loved my aunts fully and completely the entire time. She was a people collector, so she was going to collect them whether they wanted to be collected or not. But let me tell you that in those later years, when my aunt would visit from out of town, she stayed with Grandma Ruth. When my aunt moved into the same, and uncle moved into the same retirement community as Grandma Ruth. And in my Grandma Ruth's later years, when she could no longer manage to get the laundry basket up the stairs to the laundry facility, My aunt would come every week and help her do her laundry. The three of them became dear friends. And yes, family. That's what cross-bearing, that's what self-denial means sometimes. Is that we are not operating on our timeline. We are operating on God's timeline. We are in the midst as God's allies to make these things real to one another and to strangers, to offer hospitality, to truly love one's neighbor, to bless those who persecute you, and rejoice when there is reason for rejoicing, and weep when there is reason to weep. For us, cross-bearing and self-denial is a witness to God's kingdom. That those who have imprisoned themselves, as you might say, to one's self and self-service have their own reward. And those that choose to carry crosses and choose to be in relationship even in the hard times get a glimpse of God's eternal kingdom. Thanks be to God. Amen.